The mansion was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that doesn't just fill a room but presses against your skin like something's waiting to happen. On that crisp afternoon, Daniel Whitmore, one of the youngest and wealthiest tech moguls in America, walked into his sprawling estate ahead of schedule. He wasn't supposed to be home. A meeting downtown had been canceled last minute, and without a word his driver turned the car around. Daniel moved like a shadow, as he always did, silent, distant, unreadable. But this time, as he stepped into the marble corridor, he heard something he hadn't heard in months: laughter. Not mocking or cruel like his fiancée Brooks often was. This was soft, warm, alive. Drawn in by the sound, Daniel crept closer to the master bedroom and froze. There, barefoot on the polished floor, twirling in a burgundy dress she wasn't supposed to wear, was the housemaid. Her name was Grace. 24, quiet, invisible to everyone else in the mansion, including him. But in that moment, she was radiant. She danced like no one was watching, only someone was. And the way Daniel saw her, really saw her, for the first time it would change the entire course of both their lives. What began as a stolen moment of freedom would soon ripple into a reckoning neither of them could have predicted. Grace didn't hear the door creak open. She didn't see Daniel standing there, half hidden in the hallway, one hand resting lightly against the frame. She was too caught up in the rhythm, too wrapped in the joy she rarely allowed herself to feel. Her feet glided across the floor, the hem of her burgundy dress sweeping behind her like a whisper. A wooden spoon served as her microphone, and she sang softly to the Afrobeat song playing on the kitchen radio. For once, she wasn't the maid. She wasn't just Grace. She was herself. Daniel's breath caught. He'd seen this woman dozens of times, setting the table, sweeping floors, vanishing into corners like she'd been trained not to exist. And yet, here she was, glowing, free, and entirely unaware she'd just changed everything. A chuckle escaped him, soft, almost reverent, but it was enough. Grace spun around, heart leaping to her throat as her eyes locked with his. The spoon dropped from her hand. "Mr. Whitmore," she stammered, voice barely above a whisper. He held up a hand gently. "Don't stop." Her eyes widened. I didn't mean to be in here. I thought the house was empty." "I know," he said, stepping inside slowly. "You were dancing beautifully." Her cheeks flushed crimson. She backed toward the wall, embarrassed. "I'll go change. I'll clean the room." But Daniel didn't want her to vanish. Not yet. "You don't have to." "Not right away," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Something shifted in the room. The air wasn't tense, it was tender. His gaze wasn't cold or condescending anymore. It was warm, curious, human. For the first time since she'd come to this mansion, someone looked at Grace, not through her, not past her, at her. The next morning, Grace awoke early, just like always. She put on her black uniform, tied her apron, and told herself it was just a moment. He probably forgot. But as she walked into the study with his coffee tray in hand, her fingers trembling slightly, Daniel looked up from his laptop and said her name. "Thank you, Grace. Not the maid, not you, her name?" She blinked, stunned. "You're welcome, sir," he smiled faintly. "You don't have to call me sir every time." That small exchange rippled through her heart like sunlight on still water. Something fragile, but powerful had been stirred. And neither of them knew it yet, but the walls that had kept them apart for so long had just begun to fall. The days that followed moved like whispers, quiet, but undeniable. Grace found herself walking through the mansion with a strange lightness in her steps. Nothing had changed officially. She still wore the same pressed uniform, still polished the same marble floors, but everything felt different. Daniel no longer passed her like a ghost. He paused. He noticed. He asked questions, simple ones like, "How's your morning?" or "Did you sleep okay?" But to Grace, they were like music. No one had asked her that in years. Then, one afternoon, as she was dusting the hallway mirror, Daniel approached with 2 cups in hand. Coffee. One for Haim, and one he offered gently for her. "You looked like you could use a break," he said. Her hands froze on the cloth. For me, he nodded, and their fingers brushed as she accepted the cup. For a second, neither moved. They sat together on the staircase landing, sipping quietly. The air was warm, golden with late sun, but it wasn't the light that made Grace's chest flutter. It was the way Daniel looked at her. Not like she was the help, not like she was in the wrong room, but like she was someone worth knowing. "You don't talk much," she said, her voice soft but steady. He glanced at her, a rare smile curling the corner of his lips. "Neither do you. I guess we both learned to stay quiet," she said with a small laugh. Daniel's expression shifted, gentle, now thoughtful. "I used to talk a lot. Then I realized most people don't listen. They just wait to speak." Grace looked down into her coffee. "I stayed quiet so people would forget I was there. It was easier." He didn't speak for a moment. Then slowly, "You're not invisible, Grace. Not to me." Her heart stuttered. Later that night, she found herself sitting behind the laundry room, the burgundy dress folded across her lap like a memory. She wasn't wearing it, but she held it as if it still carried that spark of freedom. Meanwhile, upstairs, Daniel sat alone at the dining table, untouched dinner before him. His thoughts weren't on business or mergers or market trends. They circled back again and again to her, to the girl who danced when she thought no one was watching. He didn't know what was happening. He just knew. He didn't want it to stop. The quiet between them grew into something comforting, like a shared secret neither dared speak aloud. Each morning, Daniel found himself drifting toward the kitchen before his first meeting just to catch a glimpse of Grace stirring tea or folding linens with that quiet elegance. And each night she found herself lingering a little longer, near the study, pretending to dust bookshelves that didn't need dusting just to feel the steady hum of his presence in the same room. Then one afternoon, as the sun painted the marble floors in gold, Grace slipped into her burgundy dress again. Not to impress, not to rebel, but simply because she missed herself. The woman she was before uniforms and cold stares. She moved through the halls with her head held a little higher, humming softly as she cleaned the glass table in the guest parlor. Daniel walked in and stopped short. "You wore it again," he said, his voice low. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "I did. You look like someone who belongs here." Her hand paused on the table. Slowly, deliberately, she said, "Maybe I do." He smiled then, one of those rare, open smiles that made his eyes soften and the corners of his guarded world melt. "Would you have dinner with me tonight?" he asked, almost shyly. "Just here. Nothing fancy." Grace blinked. "Like a date," he chuckled. "Like a meal. Between two people who don't need to pretend anymore." She hesitated. Her heart fluttered. Then she nodded. "I'd like that." That evening, Grace lit a single candle on the kitchen table. She served rice and stew, humble, familiar, warm. Daniel arrived, dressed down, no suit, no stiffness, just a navy shirt with rolled sleeves. They ate slowly, laughed over simple stories, and shared pieces of themselves they rarely gave away. He told her about growing up after losing his parents, how the silence of wealth had become more suffocating than poverty ever was. She told him about the teacher's college she once dreamed of, and how losing her mother meant trading classrooms for kitchen floors. After dinner, the wind slipped through the balcony doors, and a soft rhythm played from the forgotten Bluetooth speaker in the corner. Grace stood to clear the table, her dress fluttering as she moved. "You clean up too fast," Daniel teased. "Old habits," she smiled. He stepped toward her. "You know, I've been thinking." "Dangerous?" she teased back. He laughed. Then quietly, "That day I saw you dancing. I didn't know what to say. I just knew I didn't want it to end." Grace looked down. "I didn't mean to be disrespectful." "You weren't," he said firmly. "You were free. And for the first time, this house didn't feel like stone." The speaker shifted to a familiar tune, one Grace had danced to that very day. Their eyes met. "I remember this song," he said. "I used to dance to it when I felt happy, or tried to." She replied, her voice barely audible. "Now I don't feel so alone." Daniel stepped forward, hand extended. "You never finished the dance." She hesitated, then slowly placed her hand in his. They danced, awkward at first, uncertain, but soon their steps found rhythm. Not in perfection, but in presence. Her head rested on his chest. His hand didn't tremble. For once, neither of them needed to pretend. The days that followed were gentle, soft, as morning fog, silent as shared breath. There were no dramatic declarations, no grand gestures, just two people moving through the same space, no longer pretending not to notice each other. Daniel found reasons to linger in the kitchen, while Grace worked offering to slice vegetables, though he clearly didn't know what he was doing. Grace, for her part, teased him just enough to make him smile, something the staff had rarely, if ever, seen him do. "You're holding the knife like it's about to bite you," she laughed one afternoon. "That's because it will," he said, eyes wide with mock fear. "These onions fight dirty." They laughed. And in that quiet kitchen filled with the scent of spices and fresh bread, Grace noticed something she never expected to find again: peace. Each night after the rest of the house had gone still, they would meet on the balcony, no rules, no roles. Just soft conversations under starlight. There, in the hush of evening, they shared the pieces of themselves too fragile for daylight. Grace talked about her dream of opening a daycare center. Something warm and full of love, the kind of place her younger self would have needed. Daniel spoke of a moment he'd never told anyone, sitting alone in a dark hostel room the night after his parents' funeral, whispering a promise to the sky that he'd become so successful he'd never feel pain again. "You did become successful," Grace said softly. Daniel looked out into the dark, but the pain didn't leave. She touched his arm gently. Maybe it's not supposed to. He turned to her, searching. "Why?" "Because maybe pain is what teaches us how to love gently." He said nothing, but when she turned to leave, he reached out and brushed his fingers against hers. He didn't pull. He didn't hold on. He just let her know he saw her. The next morning, something subtle but powerful shifted. Grace dressed in her usual uniform, the black one, with the stiff collar Ava had always insisted on. But it felt tighter, now unfamiliar, like clothing made for someone she no longer was. As she entered the kitchen, she found Daniel already there, holding a plate of toast. "I saved you some," he said casually, "and made tea. There's extra in the pot." She blinked. "You made tea?" He grinned. "I can boil water, Grace. Just don't tell the board." They shared breakfast like two old friends, two new hearts. Conversation flowed effortlessly. She imitated the sound of Lagos traffic and had him laughing so hard he nearly dropped his cup. He told her he once got lost in a market and had to bribe a kid with meat pie to find his way out. It didn't feel like a fairy tale. It felt real. Later that afternoon, Grace changed into her burgundy dress, not for anyone else, not to be seen, just because it reminded her who she was. She had dusting to do in the parlor when Daniel walked in and paused at the sight. "You wore it again," he said. She didn't even look up. "I did." "You look like someone who belongs here." This time she met his gaze calm and certain. "Maybe I do." That evening, the air inside the mansion shimmered with something unspoken. Not tension, not fear, but possibility. Dinner was simple. No hired chefs, no formal silverware, just Grace's home-cooked stew, a single candle flickering between them, and two mismatched plates set on the kitchen table. Daniel wore a soft navy shirt, his usual armor of wealth and power left in the closet. Grace wore her burgundy dress not to impress, but to remember the woman she was before life demanded she shrink. They ate slowly, talking between bites. Grace told stories about her childhood selling peanuts after school, chasing fireflies in the dark with her cousins reading books under a borrowed flashlight. Daniel listened like every detail mattered. He spoke, too, about building his first software in a cramped apartment, how he learned to code to block out grief, not to get rich. Then, as she cleared the dishes, the soft hum of a familiar song began to rise from the Bluetooth speaker she'd forgotten to turn off. It was that song, the one she had danced to when she thought no one was looking. Their eyes met. "I remember this," he said quietly. Grace smiled, almost shy. I used to dance to it when I was happy, or trying to be. Daniel stepped closer. Now, she exhaled slowly. Now I don't feel so alone. You never finished that dance, he said, voice gentle. Her brows lifted slightly. You want me to dance again? He didn't flinch. No, I want to dance with you. A pause. Her heart thundered in her chest. He extended his hand. Cautiously, like someone reaching for something they'd only seen in dreams, Grace placed her hand in his. They began slowly, awkwardly. Daniel wasn't much of a dancer. Grace was suddenly too aware of everything, his breath, the warmth of his palm, the steady beat of the music, and her own fluttering heartbeat. But then she laughed, and he laughed with her. Their bodies moved not perfectly, but honestly. Her head found its place against his chest. His hand rested lightly on the small of her back. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. In that dimly lit kitchen, two souls who had once lived in silence now moved in rhythm. Not as billionaire and maid, not as master and servant, but simply as Daniel and Grace. The music faded, the room stilled, and yet neither of them let go. They stood there for a while, hands intertwined, eyes closed, as if afraid that once they stepped apart, the magic might vanish. But something had shifted, not just between them, but within them. There were no promises made that night, no kisses stolen. But there was hope, a kind neither of them had dared feel in years. A seed planted not by passion, but by quiet trust. Grace wasn't invisible anymore, and Daniel, for the first time in his life, didn't feel alone in his own house. They didn't know what came next, but they both knew. They wanted to find out together. 3 days later, the peace shattered like glass. At precisely 10:17 a.m., the front door burst open. Heels clacked across the marble. Voices, sharp, entitled, filled the silence that had once cradled their quiet connection. Brooke was back. She stormed through the house like a thunderstorm wrapped in designer luggage. Where's my bag? Who moved my Fendi? Where is she? Grace stepped out of the kitchen apron, dusted with flour. Welcome back, ma'am. Brooke's sunglasses didn't hide the fury flashing in her eyes. Don't ma'am me, she snapped. I left this place spotless, and now it smells like lavender and cheap hope. She sniffed the air dramatically, marching upstairs. Grace followed quietly, heart-pounding. When Brooke reached the guest quarters, she froze. There, folded neatly on a side table, lay the burgundy dress, freshly laundered. Grace's. Brooke lifted it as if it were evidence of betrayal. You wore this. In my house. Around my fiancé. Grace's voice trembled, but she stood firm. It was my day off. I wore it when the house was empty. You think putting on a dress changes who you are? Brooke sneered. Let me remind you, you're a mop with legs. Just then, Daniel stepped into the hallway, suitcase in hand. Brooke, he said quietly. She spun around. Perfect timing. You should know what your little helper's been up to. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He looked directly at Grace. Are you okay? Her voice cracked. Yes, sir. But he heard the pain behind the words. Then he turned to Brooke, eyes, no longer soft, but steel. A word. Now. And as they walked away, Grace stood alone in the hallway, shaken heart thudding, but no longer afraid. Because this time, someone saw her. In life, there will always be people who try to reduce your worthy status by job title or by past. But your dignity doesn't come from their permission. It comes from the quiet resilience inside you. Grace's story reminds us that sometimes, even in silence, your light speaks the loudest. If this story touched you, let us know in the comments. Have you ever felt invisible until someone finally saw you for who you are? Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share for more powerful stories about courage, kindness, and reclaiming your worth. Because sometimes the ones we overlook are the ones who change everything.